And greetings to all of you. Thank you, Dennis, for really starting us off on a high note. Such a pleasure to be able to join you here, myself, but also on behalf of Undp, for what I think, as Dennis has said, is a very timely discussion on scaling green investments to address the crisis, the climate crisis. And yes, it's about capital. I want to first start by thanking our partners, the Global Green Growth Institute, and Dr. Frank Reisberman is here with us. It's wonderful to see you. But also the Institutional Investor Network, Africa Catalyst, World Bank, I believe most of them joining us online, really for your passion and your commitment to advancing the Sustainable Development Goals and the NDCs. I also want to recognize my former classmate and colleague, Rahima, who is the DG of the Africa Risk, Africa Risk. All of you in this room have one purpose, which is that we should be able to make a difference in the way we live on this planet for the good of all. And we're all painfully aware of the damage that climate change has been posing on our planet and on lives and livelihoods. And Africa actually, as I head the Africa Bureau, I have to speak about this continent. It finds itself on the front lines. The continent, as we keep saying, contributes only about 3 to 4% of global emissions, yet it is suffering disproportionate impact. Since the 70s, for instance, weather-related disasters have increased over 500% on the continent of Africa. Temperatures are rising faster than the global average. By 2030, up to 118 million extremely poor people on the continent will be exposed to drought, to floods, and to extreme heat waves. Without urgent action, climate change will unravel Africa's hard-won development achievements and also slow down the trajectory to actually achieve Africa's aspirations that are outlined in Agenda 2063. The Stockholm Environment Institute projects that African GDP per capita could plunge by up to 30% by 2050 due to climate change. That is significant. Food insecurity, poverty, inequality, and instability will, of course, worsen alongside this plunge. African countries are making efforts to move the needle on resource mobilization for climate change. Around 20 countries across the region are actually already developing financing strategies or investment plans. And we have 6 countries that are taking action to strengthen private sector involvement, which we all believe is the way to go. However, we know that Africa still lags way behind the global average on mobilizing climate finance, with 41% of countries accessing public finance, as opposed to 61% globally, and only 5% accessing private finance, when the rest of the world is at 21%. So the opportunity to grow is huge. African countries have expressed massive financial support needs that extend far beyond the scope of their available resources. If countries are to meet these climate commitments and meaningfully increase climate resilience, then finance at scale is required from all available sources, including public grants, we don't rule that out, private capital, foreign and domestic. And at some point, it will be really useful to look at how you make Africa's money work for its green growth. And of course, all the innovative approaches that we've been talking about, like green and blue bonds, as well as, of course, leveraging forest protection to preserve their potential as carbon sinks. Funds like the Green Climate Fund should be supported to provide concessional equity lines for African financial institutions, for instance, and they could use that to execute green infrastructure projects at scale. But also it could play an important part in de-risking private capital coming into the continent. The Global Commission on Adaptation found that investing $1.8 trillion globally in 5 areas, and these are early warning systems, climate resilient infrastructure, improved dryland agriculture, mangrove protection, and of course, resilient water resources, from 2020 to 2030 could generate, and listen to this, 7.1 trillion in total net benefits. So we're talking an investment dream for anyone who is in the space of the private sector. Despite the challenges, Africa has tremendous potential to pursue climate resilient, sustainable development. The continent is endowed, as we keep saying, with abundant renewable energy resources, including solar, wind, geothermal, but also hydro. With the second largest rainforest in the world, Africa also has huge potential for reforestation and carbon sequestration. And it has always been in the culture of African societies to innovate around green nature-based solutions. Pioneer climate smart approaches to agriculture, for instance. What we know today as conservation, it's rooted in many African cultures. Of course, clean energy and also infrastructure going green can find themselves in a lot of lifestyles that are indigenous to Africa. And here I want to say something about Africa's youth. A talent waiting to explode. It's not a bomb waiting to explode. I really reject this notion or narrative that Africa's young population is a bomb waiting to explode, and therefore we must create jobs for them. No, this is talent that is exploding across the continent, particularly in the field of tech. And we see innovation, we see entrepreneurial spirits growing. But also we see kind of a cabinet of conscience that is emerging from new social entrepreneurs who want to solve development challenges and problems and climate-related challenges through their talent and innovation. You find them in the startup industry. They too need capital. They need to be taken seriously by serious investors and not just regarded as, something that we do to feel good by going from pitch to pitch, hackathon to hackathon, and we can say, oh yeah, we gave 1,000 there, 2,000 there. This is a space that requires serious investment that could take the best ideas to industry levels in really cultivating a green pathway for the continent. For over 4 decades, UNDP has worked together with African governments and communities to drive climate investment and build resilience. I was myself a UNDP resident representative in 3 countries over a decade, and I saw firsthand how we can take an issue that is labeled a crisis and make an opportunity out of it in terms of transforming lives of people in communities. We never thought that climate justice was possible. how do you, if you are hosting a major forest, how do you as a community benefit from that forest, from the fruits of that forest, while also protecting it? So the incentive for the protection is that it first and foremost will benefit the community that's hosted, but then you see those communities really willing to do what it takes to conserve and protect, but they must feel the benefits. We cannot continue to reinforce extractive approaches and then expect communities to step in and be partners in this climate journey. This is the work that UNDP does. It's really bringing that magic at that sweet spot of getting communities to commit to be partners in this green journey, but also ensuring that they see the benefits directly in the way they live. Our climate portfolio in Africa stands at over $2.3 billion across 37 countries. And let me just highlight a few examples. In Ethiopia, UNDP assisted the government to design a climate resilient green economy strategy and investment plan now being implemented. And I was a witness of this firsthand. All Ethiopia's industrial parks, I was there for 3 years as UN resident coordinator, are really designed with a green pathway. It's incredible. With investments from private sector to make that green pathway possible, but also a commitment by the government that could be using that money for many other social activities to actually insist that their development, their industrialization will follow greener pathways. And this needs to be rewarded. I mean, the world needs to recognize that these efforts are being made in the most unlikely corners of our planet, and therefore reward them with not telling them to go to the market and borrow at the highest of costs to tackle some of these challenges, but making available capital that is a lot cheaper and more productive. We helped leverage 150 million from the Green Climate Fund for sustainable land restoration and resilient livelihoods for 5 million smallholder farmers in this country, Ethiopia. In Tunisia, UNDP designed a $100 million GCF project to provide solar-powered irrigation and climate-smart technologies for smallholder farmers, especially women. It is anticipated that to actually benefit 15,000 people directly. Sounds small, but imagine the ripple effect that creates in terms of kids going to school, in terms of elderly people being able to get care, in terms of medical attention to the sick. In both Kenya and Nigeria, UNDP provided advisory support for the launch of maiden sovereign green bonds in 2021, raising 150 million each for eco-friendly infrastructure. Across the Sahel region, UNDP programs have mobilized over $80 million to deploy solar-powered irrigation for smallholder farmers, boosting climate resilience and food security for vulnerable communities. And in South Africa, very pleased to say that we assisted the Development Bank of South Africa to issue a $238 million green bond, which financed low carbon infrastructure across the country. So it's possible to do. These examples demonstrate that Africa is ripe with bankable, investable climate solutions. The ideas are there. We need to liberate them by unlocking the financing to actually have the results on the ground. But so realizing the continent's full potential requires multi-stakeholder collaboration, including government, private sector, civil society, and communities. And that's why we're here today having this conversation. Governments must foster enabling policies, regulatory frameworks, incentives, and also strong institutions to be able to anchor these kinds of processes and investments. The private sector has to move towards responsible, eco-friendly models. And I believe some of them are ready to go. Local communities must be engaged as partners on the ground. And it's essential to note that poverty eradication and gender dimensions of our climate initiative is central. For UNDP, climate change must be viewed from a development lens and as a development opportunity. It could be the pathway to ending poverty for good, but also ending inequality, including gender inequality. Over 40% of UNDP's climate change adaptation projects in Africa explicitly target women and girls. Across Africa, UNDP prioritizes female participation in climate adaptation planning processes and also in leadership within local resilience communities. At the policy level, we assist communities to mainstream gender considerations into the NDCs and also the national adaptation plans under the Paris Agreement. We work to bolster women's voices within climate activism and policy making, supporting networks like the African Leaders Network on Climate Change. Why? Because women at the end of the day bear the brunt of some of the consequences of not going with. Just take clean cooking as one example. And how many women, who cooks in Africa? Women. Maybe you have the 0.0%. My husband never cooks, and he's a typical African. So women are the most vulnerable, the most exposed, and their lungs are getting darker and darker by the day. And so it's important that whatever conversation we're having here today and subsequently take into account the impact that these things have on women, and therefore put women at the center, not just as passive recipients, but as agents that are also bringing solutions to the table. Events like this offer valuable opportunities to build the partnerships and collective action that is needed. UNDP remains firmly committed to working in partnership with the stakeholders around this table and beyond, on the continent and globally, to drive forward this agenda. There is really not a moment to spare. Climate impacts are increasing, and we were just reminded of this recently with the situation in Morocco and in Libya. And with every disaster, is a cost to lives in the thousands. Let's not grow numb to this impact of loss of lives. My plea, was we discussed today, is for us to feel the pain. So many people have been affected by it, and insist that our own pathways and those of the institutions we drive will continue to insist on finding real solutions that give people a fair chance. Thank you all very much, and I wish us an energetic, enthusiastic, productive
I know Ahuna has to leave very soon, and so I am not going to ask anybody to ask any questions. However, I would like to make a very, very important point. For those of you that have just come in, welcome. For those of you who have to leave, like who of you who have just come in, like my colleague Elfine, I am going to, sorry.
Thank you. There's an empty seat next to
Where?
the GSG. She has
Me?
to go. No, yes, you can go.
So I have to move to that side.
She has to go.
Move there.
The seat is empty. She has to go.
You are coordinating.
I like this seat.
You are moderating.
Please go ahead.
So, she's asked me to move. Let me just move very quickly. When they asked me to facilitate this event, I was quite excited about doing that. I found out something that each of you has a real opportunity to take advantage of the facilitative power of the Gggi. As Frank will tell you, Frank, the reason I don't want to use your last name is because I don't want to butcher it. So let me try and say, is it Fischbaman?
It's just Reisman, like a good Dutch name.
Reisbaman.
IJ is a Y. That's it.
So I am going to call you Frank.
That works for me too.
So the reason I'm bringing this up is that this institution has managed to put together over $7 billion. But more importantly, the reason why I asked some of my colleagues, some of the people that we invited here, Delphine, again, the reason I asked you to come to this event is there are real partners in this room that can actually help us do that most important thing, that by the time people walk out of this room, there'll be some commitments. Now, in the afternoon, there is going to be a pitch session, a session where people like my friend Nicole will be able to go and speak to institutional investors about increasing the volume of capital in Africa. So from that perspective, it allows me to speak about something that I know very well. Let's just go back to talking about capital and foreign direct investment and why Gggi is of absolute importance. So for me, it's how do you catalyze something as complex as climate change? And how do you catalyze climate change to people whose mothers used to cook with charcoal or wood ever since they were kids? They are used to the system. How do you catalyze climate change and how do you operationalize it? That's something that I would like Frank to talk about because it is the essence of Gggi. The second part for me is strengthening policy planning. I will say it from this perspective. If you look at what they call national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions, the reason why these are very important is that you have people from Gggi sitting in the ministries, sitting in the offices with the policymakers. My big challenge and my big challenge to Gggi is how do we get more interested people to the table, away from people like us, bureaucrats who don't necessarily look at the fundamental investment question, which then takes me to the next part, promoting nature-based solutions. Again, I would like Frank to address some of these things. Don't forget, I will come to the risk aspects of this because Nicholas talked about this, or Nico talked about this earlier. Talking about advancing sustainable urban development, cross-cutting focus ultimately on poverty eradication and the things that come with it. Ladies and gentlemen, I am so happy to introduce the Director General of the Global Green Growth Initiative. If anybody wants to understand how difficult this role is, think about these words: global green growth. It's almost like an oxymoron. Frank, welcome.
Stand here for a moment. Indeed, we heard already the Director for Africa of Undp speak as very often about the potential for Africa. Why is it not happening fast enough, right? So I'd like to get practical, following up here. We indeed are a younger intergovernmental organization, quite like Undp, but set up only 10 years ago, very much focusing on this question. How can we help governments have greener policies? How can we then help them leverage more finance? Yes, we've, in the relatively short time that we exist, you mentioned 7 billion, but I think by the end of this year, help mobilize about 12 billion. That's not enough, but just to show that the money is actually there, and that if the gap can be bridged between the government amounts and the private sector interest to invest, there is actually money there. You know, because the contradiction is too often when we go speak to our member countries, they say, we have all these great projects, there's no money. We go speak to investors, they say, we have all this money, there are really no good projects. That, I think, is a very often heard contradiction. So how can we bring those two together? How can we work on either better bankable projects? Regional director said there are many. I think there are not enough. There are some good examples, we gave some, but there's not this tidal wave that really African countries need. So how can we get much better projects that have a good business model, that have good credit guarantees or ways to reduce risk, and bring things to investors that actually are attractive to them? That's for project financing. Beyond that, there are so many other instruments that we could use. And I think I see a lot of new instruments in other parts of the world that are worth exploring, whether the lessons learned from Ecuador's debt for nature swap this year, largest debt for nature swap so far, you know, a new blue bonds to protect the Galapagos Marine Reserve, helped Ecuador reduce their debt by about $1 billion and gave them some fresh cash. And yes, they made some very strong commitments for, in that case, marine conservation. In other cases, those could be debt for climate swaps. And yes, particularly things like nature-based solutions, where we do need some governments to help with conservation, are a very good option, I believe. And yes, we see the market for green bonds. I say green bonds as an inclusive term. Sometimes they are sustainable bonds, sometimes they are blue bonds. We helped Mexican bank issue a resilient bond this year. So how can we help this very quick flood of green financing reach Africa? Because there's only a very small percentage of green bonds at the moment that are issued in Africa. So both, I think, structuring more bankable projects that are attractive to investors. Yes, we already heard a few references to things like lending finance or public-private partnership or risk reduction, all those kind of instruments that we can have to make projects more bankable. I think we should discuss them here. How do we, in a practical way, bring those to the table? Both for better project financing and for innovative solutions around sustainable finance. And yes, we already know governments are critical, whether it is to put in place the right enabling environment or to put that share of public money on the table that is very important. But it won't succeed if we don't manage to leverage the private sector in a much, much bigger way than we've seen today. I know we're focusing on Africa here, but sometimes it might be worth saying, so why did it work so much better in Asia? What did they have? Is there something that Vietnam, a country that has developed pretty rapidly, started to become coffee exporter from almost nothing to one of the largest in the world? What are some of the lessons that we can learn from different parts of the world and make sure that they are, of course, applicable to Africa, that they are contextualized, that we indeed use, as the regional director said, that explosion of talent across the continent that is definitely there that will make that happen. So we're co-hosting this with Undp. We're very happy to have you here. We're very happy that there are some bright minds around the table here. We hope to have a good discussion around not only the general principles, but a bit the practical action of making this happen today. And yes, we can take that forward to a pitching session in the afternoon. Sana from our team that has been working on this, she's hoping that by the end of the week we'll have some deals closed. Now, that's not the usual way that the United Nations works it, as you know. It takes a few years to go from idea to a closed deal. But in a way, that speeding up will be necessary. When I work with the private sector, and we try to bring them together with governments, they would usually say, okay, This is the beginning of the quarter. What can we do in the next 3 months? If there's nothing to be done this quarter, then there's nothing to do. Nobody was interested to talk about a project that could start in a year and a half or 2 years from now. So I think I would like to put that on the table as well. How can we bridge this gap in expectations on speed between the private sector and the governments and the international organizations that need to work together? Can I leave it at that?
Thank you very much. No, I'm going to be very brief in my rejoinder. First, I might have used the word initiative. It is actually the Gggi, which is institute. So let's discuss it from the word institute and the institutionalization part of it. One of the biggest challenges that I'm sure Frank and his team go through on a regular basis, and I've underestimated it, it is the fact that Africa has many projects that are feasible, or maybe too few projects that are feasible. And on the other side, you have people that are looking for projects that are feasible, and there is so much money. I know for a fact that $4.4 billion was raised from private markets in the past 24 months or less. So I want to switch quickly to something that Frank was talking about, which is making these projects feasible, making them viable. And I would like, and I'm very happy to introduce somebody who was Ahuna's classmate, and I'm not going to mess up his name, Ibrahima Sheikh John.
Yes,
Right?
you're right.
He's the United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Director for the African Risk Capacity Group. But just think about it from that perspective. Why is there no risk capacity group for the European Union? Why is there no risk capacity group for Singapore? Why are we stuck with this man as the director? Thank you very much, sir. Welcome. I hope I haven't set your expectations up too high, because you hold the key.
Absolutely. I am not going to tell you when I went to school. When I lived with us about almost 25 years ago. Doesn't make us any younger. So she and I went to grad school here in New York many, many years ago. In those days, we spent a lot of time brainstorming about how we can change Africa and transform Africa. So to find ourselves in two different capacities doing what we do for the continent is certainly something that we could not actually anticipate 30 years ago. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Bonjour, salam alaikum, and bon dia for those who are watching us from around the world. I want to bring up a different perspective in the conversation in addition to what Frank has said, and talk about a little more about the resilient questions of climate change, because we tend to forget this. And I said yesterday, a different platform, there's a human face to climate change. And that is the drought in the Horn of Africa. That's the flood we recently witnessed in South Africa, but also in other parts of Africa. And all of them have something in common. They affect the life and livelihood of many Africans, be it food security or be it people actually losing their assets to survive. And this is something I think, while we get technical, let's put it on the table, because to me, that's our motivation on a daily basis as an organization to make sure we are confident that what we're doing ultimately will impact the life of many Africans. I think second, just to say, for that to be addressed, it requires, first of all, leadership. In my organization, it's a great example of what you can achieve with leadership. And then just think about for a second, we belong to the African Union, we're managed by the United Nations, we belong to our member states, and we're funded by a number of partners in this room. And that is the spirit of COP27, global climate action, and global solidarity. Now, to be extremely pragmatic, what is that we can do together collectively in building a resilience? And I think it was, Amina Mohammed reminded me, don't talk about investment, but smart investment. And that is investment that could actually lead to affecting the life and livelihood of many Africans. And if I were to actually invest and anything that in resilience. Number one, I want to mention it in passing. You heard about it a couple of times, the access to early warning system in Africa. And the business that I'm in, it does save life, and whatever we can do to make it accessible to Africans, certainly will make policymakers to make informed decisions. Just to give you an example, in Madagascar, when they faced tropical cyclone, the fact that we made early warning system available to the government 5 days before the cyclone, they managed to move actually 5,000 people away from harm's way. So it's not just technical, it's not about science, it's about human face, whereby I think in our investment, it's important we can put more resources into making early warning system actually accessible to African countries, be it tropical cyclone or drought. And in fact, the African Union has come up with something extremely smart by creating what they call the flood situation room, whereby people actually monitor the evolution of flood and provide information to policymakers so they can decide what to do before it's actually too late. So I think my first recommendation on the table is let's make the early warning system accessible, not just general talk, but something that's actually accessible, knowing obviously it's not one size fits all, each country has a different type of disasters. I think second, I haven't been in government before. One of the things I observe is that disasters management is not embedded into public policies in most of our countries. We wait till it happened. By the time it gets in, it's quite late. And I think those who are in the business of disasters management understand the first 2 weeks of any disasters, that's where you have to save lives. If you don't have the actual resources available, it may be a little bit too late. And I've spoken to some of the humanitarian agencies who did tell me, despite the fact that they've done so much over the years, they began to see the limitation of humanitarian intervention because funding may be actually available at times it's too late. And that's why the culture of contingency planning is something, in my view, that we should put on the table in our investment in making sure we help African government to anticipate, because managing is anticipating and governing is actually anticipating as well. I think last but not least, and this is something that I said yesterday, what are the kind of innovative financing we need to put in place to make sure we can actually make funding available for response? And I think this is where the insurance market comes in. In our line of work, we believe that if you can actually profile the risk, you may be able to actually find ways in mobilizing resources so that your first response is actually funded off budget by the government to the insurance market. So what we do, which I find extremely innovative, is by pulling the risk of this African government, take them to the insurance market so you can make premium actually more affordable, as opposed to the usual going there was your own risk as a country. And I think collectively in our investment, it's important that we actually look at the insurance market as a way of mobilizing resources. Now, the biggest challenges in the insurance market is what I call the AAA of insurance. And that is the affordability, the availability, and the accessibility of premium financing. And that's the reason why, with the support of most of our partners, we're able to actually mobilize resources to provide the subsidies where necessary to build the culture of disasters management. And I think this is something certainly we can, allocate some of the resources into supporting the premium. Now, just to wrap up, let me put one big idea on the table, and this is always something I always think is important. What I just described to you, it's not a concept anymore. We're doing it for 10 years. It's about $1 billion worth of coverage, about $150 million of payout, and about 100 million people actually protected. And the last KPI, it's the most important part, and that's the one that we protect. So my big idea is that as we go into climate ambition summit, this week, I'm invited to speak at a conversation about what do we do with the loss and damage fund when it's available. And I believe, as far as Africa is concerned, if you can put together an Africa climate preparedness and response facility, that's a way of helping Africans to have access to resources so that no one is left behind. So I look forward to working with Gggi, with whom we're going to be signing an MOU sometime this week, as a way of joining forces in the spirit of COP27, whereby global climate action requires global solidarity. And of course, and as my classmate left the room, yes, went to school 10 years ago trying to change Africa, and I'm glad we're here doing exactly what we wanted to do 10 years ago, make you know what it's like now. Thank you very much.
Allow me to first apologize for the late start. One of the reasons we were very late is because we kept thinking that the president of Comoros was going to show up. What's very interesting, and I bring up Comoros, is because the African Union is now the 21st member of G20, which is no longer the G20, it's now the G21. What does this mean? It means that small countries have capacity to be at the same level as the big countries. They are being represented by a very important entity. Now, I am segging from the small countries because the next speaker is not small. Harold, I'm talking about you. Harold is from Cape Verde. And for anybody that understands the essence of Cape Verde, they have an even bigger population of Cape Verdeans in the United States. They live in Massachusetts. My point is this. Harold represents a certain section of the World Bank Group. And if you look at his card, it says Alternate Executive Director, EDS 13, Africa Group 2, which means it's a collection of countries. For those people who have been to the World Bank in Washington, the essence is bigger, and the fact that Harold does not just look after Cape Verde, I think for me is the essence of development. Harold,
Yeah.
welcome, and the table is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, for the introduction. It's really great to be here. And first, I just want to, you said I'm here on behalf of our Executive Director, Abdul Salam Bello. Unfortunately, couldn't make it, and I'm here to speak on his behalf. And first of all, I want to thank the Gggi for invitation, and also Una is not here, but for hosting us. It's great to be here because of the opportunity discussion, the crucial discussion that we have, particularly on scaling up the green investment to combat climate change. And as Dennis made a brief introduction of myself, I just want to say that I'm going to wear the introduction. I have to wear a few hats, but definitely two hats now. And one as a member of the board of the World Bank, and saying that first I have to speak on behalf of the World Bank, which it has now become the leading multilateral institution in climate finance. Only for this year, we allocated $36.8 billion for the commitment to climate change. And my second hat, it's regarding the 23 countries that I represent. As Dennis said, I'm original from Cape Verde. Cape Verde is one of the countries that I represent. I represent the 22 other countries. That includes Comoros, as Dennis mentioned. That means it's under the umbrella of small states. But most of the countries that I represent are Francophone countries, West Africa and Central Africa. And as you can see, I got big things to fill in. I represent those countries. Ayuna mentioned and others has mentioned, it's very important to get a background where we are, particularly regarding the climate change, the challenge that we face. First, I want to underscoring that climate change will transcend mere environmental concern. It stands as a global crisis with particular severe repercussion in Africa. I also want to stress on the region's high vulnerability to climate-related disasters such as drought, floods, and extreme weather events, and indicate that the significant toll it has on African communities. Few examples. Recently, the Ghana and Africa recent grappling with the most severe drought in decades. One of them, the country that is facing by Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and those are the really heat one on that part. The agricultural output and food security are significant compromise. The number of internally displaced persons due to catastrophic drought impacts on pastoral and farming livelihood has surged, exacerbating hunger. Many regions in Sahel experience substantial flooding, and we have seen that recently in Nigeria, Niger, Chad. And we have seen, for example, Mozambique, the catastrophic cyclone. But this is to give an example of which I want to share a few key points, mainly using the hats that I have said before. The World Bank is making significant progress in climate finance, including a commitment of $5 billion over the next 5 years for initiatives like the Great Green Wall and dry land restoration in Africa. As of July 1st, 2023, the World Bank has embraced the Paris Alignment, demonstrating its readiness to lead in climate finance across policy, operation, and finance mechanisms. The ongoing World Bank Group Evolution Roadmap aims to make the World Bank Group more effective in addressing global challenges, including climate change. This reform will also support domestic resource mobilization and green bond insurance. On this, because it was mentioned earlier, there's two examples that I would like to use. Particularly, recently, the Gabon recent blue bond, and particularly the debt swap they created. And I know the example you gave, Ecuador. And the other example is key for also debt swap with Portugal. That was in June that the agreement was signed. And this all is towards the blue economy, sustainable and unsustainability, particularly in green and blue. And that's the effect of domino we need to see. And we have seen this in Ecuador, but we see this happen in the continent in Africa. But others needs to come. I think Dennis made a really good point, and he not only when he introduced me as a Cape Verdean, but he made a good point on remittance. I think that would be something to look at how you use the remittance to a sustainable investment finance. The World Bank require more concessional resource, private capital through IFC and MIGA, in partnership with organizations like Gggi, GCF, and CIF to jointly implement projects and promote green, blue, and social bonds. I will mention later the importance of partnership, but I just want to say that the World Bank is taking really in consideration account the importance of the partnership, and it's been a big topic on the evolution discussion. Our focus should be on the partnership scale and replicability, with a particular emphasis and adaptation, resilience, and mitigation. We must pay special attention to local communities, women, girls, and young people. As he mentioned earlier, yes, Africans are young. It's a very young continent with a big young population. It's very important to take into consideration the young population and be an asset for the continent as we look ahead on this fight and this common cause, which is climate change. Regarding the second point, which is using my second hat, we advocated for our office, the executive director and myself. We advocated for a joint strategy between Gggi and African Group to constituent of the World Bank Group to scale up climate finance, enhance capacity building, and foster coherence and synergies in addressing climate change. The recent African Climate Summit, the declaration underscores the needs to fulfill climate finance commitment to Africa. Private sector opportunity in green energy abound, particularly in Africa, where investment has been disproportionately low. Collaboration is essential to de-risk and scale up clean energy projects, such as through World Bank Group Scaling Solar Program. I hope I propose a partnership to address capacity gaps through training and technical system and national and regional projects to ultimately interested in Africa's vast natural resource for sustainable development. And said that, thank you for your attention and for having us here. Thank you.
Sheikh, before you go, I'm sorry, I have to hold you for just 1 second.
Sure.
Because, and Harold, I'm just going to ask if you could give us a few more minutes.
Yes, sure.
Because we have a major point to bring to the table. We have the risk aspects, we have the patient capital aspects, and you people provide patient capital and concessionary financing. For those who do not understand the difference between regular financing and concessional financing or concessionary financing, it's of absolute importance to bring these two things. I don't know how if people realize, but the African Development Bank does not even lend directly to a large number of African institutions. They basically have to deploy the African Development Fund from that perspective. So I would like to ask a question to both Harold and Sheikh. I know I'm using your middle name because
That's
it's
fine.
the Ibrahima if Sheikh. I'd like to use it. I was going to use His Excellency or Their Excellencies or Doctor, but I'm thinking let's keep it.
War family.
So let's ask a very important question. What would it take, apart from an act of God, for us to resolve these climate change issues, not just in Africa, but in as many developing countries as possible? I want to just start with you, Your Excellency, just to hear those dreams that you and Her Excellency Ahuna had a long time ago. What are some of those things coming to the table? And then Harold, and we'll let both of you go.
Well, I mean, I think 30 years ago, when she and I were talking about transforming Africa, and fast forward 30 years later, the availability, accessibility to risk profiling has made so much progress to the extent that this is a tool which I believe both policymakers in Africa, those who are trying to attract investment to Africa, should certainly use as a tool to actually demonstrate Africa is not as risky as it's perceived, because the numbers may show actually it's not a one-size-fits-all. And I think that's, to me, to hear that the African doing it is pushing the angle of creating an Africa risk profiling kind of institutions. It's the path to finding the solution in showing the real risk perception of the continent as opposed to the perception that what we have. Because ultimately, capital will move around the world on the basis basically on the risk perception and the risk reality. And I think this is one way of basically helping Africa to attract more funding. Now, there's a different type of risk. The risk that we're dealing with as an institution is called parametric risk. It's basically dealing with extreme weather conditions, and that's why I talked about the resilience side. But there's also the political risk. There's so many different institutions on the continent. We're trying to deal with this different type of risk, political risk, parametric risk, and other risks that we can address. And I think ultimately the conversation has been to start from there and say, what are some of the incentives we need to put in place to make sure that Africa, the perception is different from the reality? Until we do that, it's going to be very difficult to actually trust some of the investors who are looking at Africa as a risky destination to go to. I think second, which I think is extremely critical, and I've known this because I've been in government before, and pushing the angle of project preparation. You can't fund an idea, you fund a project, not an idea. So the idea of building the capabilities of African countries and government to be able to actually prepare the project and bring it to a level of maturity before they take it to the market, in my view, it's going to make a tremendous difference in talking about opportunities as opposed to talking about an idea which may not be actually to an opportunity. And I think there in Africa, or the African Development Bank, most institutions are understanding the power of project preparation, to the extent that actually the African Development Bank has launched an initiative called Gggi, which is the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. Unless you spend a lot of resources in preparing projects, ultimately you may not be able to attract the investment to talk about. And I think with Gggi, we'll have the conversation to further project preparation. But I think the last one is just implementation of projects. I was in government for 4 years in Senegal, but I left the World Bank and IFC, and we were able to put together a new airport, a new toll road, build the energy sector, and eventually a new airline. And the reason why we're able to do that is because the capabilities within government were able to actually negotiate structured deals to the extent that when you deal with investors, they're being taken seriously. And I think there also the issue of capacities is extremely critical in providing the comfort level for the investors that you're dealing actually with professional with government, as opposed to dealing with people who have ideas, but they can't bring it to a level to talk about what kind of investment to talk about, equity, debt, quasi-equity, or guarantees and so on. And I think that should be part of the conversation. How do you build that ecosystem that makes this investment possible? And that will be my contribution to your question.
So I'm going to just apologize to you, Frank, because Harold wants to say something, but I promise that if you see the documents that we are working with, and if you look at the bottom line for this event, if we can get as many commitments from the guys with the laptops, everybody who has signed an MOU, if we can get as many commitments, we have the capacity to change as many things as possible. Let me just quickly jump to Harold before I come to you, Frank. And I understand if anybody wants to speak to His Excellency, I believe you can, but don't walk out as he walks out. Okay.
And by
go
the way,
ahead,
he's
Harold.
called me Ibrahim, and not His Excellency.
This is a great meeting. Everybody's on a first name basis. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Dennis. And my apologies, I have to leave. The reason is because I have to go. I have another commitment. But get for your point, I think the most important thing for Africa is the question of constitutionality, which you point out because of we know the stress regarding debt the country in Africa are going through now. And on the discussion on context of evolution, we've been advocating the importance of have the constitutionality, importance of the African country have access to finance because COVID has shown us a lot of things. And one of the examples we like to use is that when the COVID hit, African countries spend more money in paying debt than investment, for example, in health, education. And when debt was on hold, that fund was very important to mitigate the impact of COVID. And that has given us the reason to come up some innovative pilots program that we're introducing on the discussion. And one of them is constitutionality, the importance of country has the cost of borrowing money cannot be expensive. An example, for African country to borrow money, it's more expensive for them to borrow money compared with the South American countries. And we came.
Do they have the same risk profile?
That's what I was talking about.
That's for example, you look into Argentina, and we have known the Argentine economy throughout decades how it has been very up and down.
Yeah.
However, for them to borrow money is way cheaper than a country like South Africa or any other country in Africa. And this to show you the importance of this discussion, and we need to support everybody to push to make sure that African borrow money in a cheaper price too. That's one thing. And the other thing is the importance of looking to the knowledge part. We have a young continent. We have referred this earlier, but I think training, build capacity is very important that we can get our young people prepared to particularly the challenges out there as we're moving forward. We still need, there's new challenge will come, but we need to be prepared for the new challenge and the current challenge. I think those two things are very important as we're still facing a lot of challenge in the continent. And for us to be successful, to be able to turn the corner, we need to look into those.
I would like to apologize to anybody that I interrupted. I didn't mean to do this. However, we were interrupted by weather today. We lost the president of Comoros. We lost John Kerry, the former Secretary of State. We've lost practically everybody. And if you were here earlier, you would have seen that the First Lady of Brazil was actually in this room and we couldn't do anything. So again, I would like to apologize on behalf of Gggi Institute, not initiative. So I want to just ask you, Frank, knowing that you now have two very good friends, and don't forget that about that 31 billion that the World Bank said they had laid out on the table. In your opinion, in your relationship with these two gentlemen and their institutions, what is it that you would like as a commitment? Should they write their commitment now on the table? Because we will take that. What would you like from the two of them?
Well, the World Bank is a very able partner. It has, it can do almost everything by itself. So it's good to hear that it's also willing to partner in some areas, and we are indeed working together with the World Bank on things like, power sector reform, so that you can have more stable grids and therefore get larger volumes of renewable energy in there. I think, in a way, there are many other smaller stakeholders in Africa, smaller investment banks, smaller development banks that don't have all the capacity that the World Bank has. They, in a way, need partnering with us more because the number of people that know about green finance or about climate finance in the BOAD or some of the other smaller banks is quite low. So while we're happy to work with the World Bank, I think our primary target is the many other smaller institutions that have a much bigger jump to make. And yes, with Africa Risk Capacity, I think they are working on a very important topic of, getting countries to really think about early warning systems, about insurance and ways that are a critical part of adaptation, which is, of course, the number one climate agenda in Africa. So we look forward to working with both of these, but with many other stakeholders around the world as well.
I want to thank you, gentlemen. We have a photo shoot happening very soon, but I need a few moments to talk about some of the elements that I have picked up from each of the people that spoke. So I have two hats. I'm an American politics professor, and I'm also an international business professor. And one of the biggest challenges you have from students is they're always asking, you're from Africa. How? Actually, I promise they always ask the other side, but why are we listening to you? And what's interesting is the American system is proliferated around the world. If you want to understand China, China has adopted very many of America's corporate governance systems. But jump to the other side, the international business side. I am such a believer in capital, but this is not about me. What I really want to say is each and every one of the people that are in this room, everybody that has spoken, and I know some people who are going to pitch their potential capital investments. I just want to say that there is a real opportunity here for us to collaborate, to work together on these things. And if I know very well, I have begged both Ibrahima and Harold to stay longer. Because of the photo shoot, we have a professional photographer who will make you look better, make you look younger. I want to ask the last speaker today, Dr. Mohamedou Tunkara. Is Mohamedou here? Oh, you could have just said. I'm going to ask Dr. Tunkara to just provide us with the closing marks, and you're the only person I'll put under pressure. You have 30 seconds. No, just joking. Please go ahead. And Harold, if you want to harass him to reduce his time, we'll be fine. Thank you very much.
You want me to do it here?
No, please. I think you have to do it up there. Thank you so much for staying. Thank you so much.
You don't want to.
Thank you very much, Harold. Before you go, I'm going to just.
Yeah, I'm going to give
piece of paper
yes.
that,
I'll stay and listen to you.
okay, thank you.
To be rude.
Thank you.
I owe you.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for the excellent facilitation of this session. I think many of the speakers talked about some of the challenges we are facing when it comes to mobilizing green and climate finance. The issues goes beyond the capacity gaps or the quality of the project or the availability of financing, but it comes down also to thinking long-term, thinking big, and to what extent is the solutions that we are proposing they are actually meeting the scale and the magnitude of the problems. And that is often missing. There are many organizations involved into small-scale pilot projects. But once those small-scale pilot projects are financed, they don't actually give you the result that you're expecting. So thinking big is important. Thinking large-scale, impactful, and transformative solutions is key. The second one also, we didn't mention that much, is that out of the almost $10+ billion that Gggi has helped members mobilizing over the past few years, about 50–60% came from the private sector. So it means it's possible to mobilize from the private sector. The private sector is very good into moving fast once they believe in something. But they are not interested into investing a lot of time from the ideation, origination, and so that's where we come in and bridging that gap. The gap in terms of making green bankable projects, getting them market ready, is a key part of the work that we need to do. And the strategic partnership is always going to help us move fast. We've been hearing a lot about scaling up, about accelerating the solution that we're implementing. We need to then move into action. How do we do that faster? And how fast can government also move it fast? Dennis, you mentioned Gggi being embedded into ministries. It's an important part because we come across two types of situations. Sometimes we have policies which exist, but they don't have the green perspective. And we need to help government, member states, to revise those policies and incorporate the green components. The second scenario is that sometimes these policies don't exist at all. And we need to bring solutions or experience from other places to help develop policies that not only help into accelerating green growth, but also green investment. So the green investment part is an important one. Undp Regional Director mentioned, how do we make the Africa money works for Africa? I think this is something we need to reflect seriously on because it is possible. It's happening in other regions. Why not in Africa? And we have participants from other regions, and I believe we have our friends from Qatar here in the room. Blended finance is key. I think having the guarantee mechanism, whether it's coming from our partner like the Green Climate Fund or from other government institutions, it helps to de-risk the investment. It helps to de-risk, attract private sector basically coming and investing more. So the blended finance is going to be an important part. And I think what is crucial is that we don't have meetings that will be just another meeting. But out of the meeting, we have concrete action that we can implement and get moving faster so that we can show results. So those are the 30 seconds.
No. Please go. You know what's funny is that we still have time until 12:45. So please, no, please. Thank you.
But I want to close on this these remarks to say that I think for us it's really a great opportunity with ARC later in the week to sign the MOU. And that is part of the strategic partnership we need to build. And many others in the room here, I think the conversation will take us through the process of developing those partnerships, not for the sake of having partnerships, but actually a partnership that will help us to develop and implement solutions that government will help the government to deliver on their ambitions, the climate ambitions, and making those climate ambitions even more ambitious. From the national determined contributions that we have to plan and make them more ambitious and implement them to other flagship programs that governments are developing. There are ways to actually make those initiatives much more ambitious and develop the financing necessary to implement them. Thank you, all of you, and we look forward to advancing our collaboration and investing more into programs and projects. Thank you.
I would like to humbly thank Frank for allowing me to actually facilitate your event. I bullied my way into getting this done. I wanted to get this done very quickly, but there's something that's very important in this room. Unlike very many of these events that we go to, you don't really have the actual decision makers at the table. And when I say decision makers, I mean people that are going to be able to pitch their projects. You have people from the African risk capacity. For me, that's really, really important. I would also like to I'm very biased, not about Uganda, but about the Democratic Republic of Congo. Because if it has the world's arguably first or second, I like first, basin, if it has the first or the largest lung of Africa, we really should be doing something more. I know very well that Gggi Institute has offices in Morocco and Senegal, but I would like to advocate the Democratic Republic of Congo. Why? I recently became very good friends with one of the most successful investment, or not investment funds, one of the most successful investors in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I dragged Elfin Kakuji here today. Elfin's firm is $51 million in total assets. Now, why do I talk about that? It's because it would like to move into co-financing. So if you want to become friends with Elfine, she's right there. I think that there are so many opportunities, and Frank, I'm hoping that we will ultimately increase the commitments to your entity, to our entity, and to our planet. Thank you so much. I would like to thank you again for waiting until the end, but we are ahead of schedule. But I know Frank might want something to say. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We have pictures to take. I believe somebody's taking pictures. Please take the pictures. I would like to invite people to take pictures. And before we do that, Raymond, on behalf of our friends, thank you very much for hosting us.
A group photo?
Yes, a group photograph. Everybody, can we please take a photograph with everybody?